The first time Curian saw a human's pupils dilate from fear, he nearly called for a medical emergency. He hadn't yet learned that humans did that on purpose. The Academy of Interspecies Exchange had accepted its first human student cohort only 6 Earth months prior, and Curian, like most of his peers from the Threxian system, had studied the species with a clinical detachment. Muscularly inefficient, emotionally erratic, and biologically fragile, the humans were a curiosity at best. And then he got paired with Caleb Dorn. Caleb arrived late to their first joint field practicum, his shirt half untucked and a faint smear of blood drying on his knuckle. "You are hemorrhaging," Curian noted. Caleb looked down. "Oh, this? Nah, I just scraped it getting out of the bus." Door jammed. Curian tilted his head. "You should seek immediate medical attention. I'll wash it later." Caleb shrugged and slipped on his outdoor gear. "So what's this field thing?" "Some kind of survey." Curian blinked both sets of eyelids. "We are mapping behavioral reactions during simulated threat environments. There will be controlled stress triggers." Caleb grinned. "Oh, cool. Like fear tests." "Correct." Caleb's pupils dilated. Curian recorded it instantly, tagging the data with a notation. "Unprovoked dilation. Possibly defective." The simulation began in the artificial terrain dome. Dim lighting, uneven footing, distant howls, all designed to elevate stress levels gradually. For most of the species in the Academy, it worked. Elevated breathing, defensive posture, retreat patterns. Caleb jogged forward. "Is this sound real?" he called across the terrain. "No," Curian said, watching his readings spike. "It is auditory simulation." "Nice. Sounds like a bear. I used to camp a lot." Curian's appendages stiffened. "You are not responding as expected." Caleb turned, a gleam in his eye. "You mean I'm not freaking out?" "Yes." Caleb laughed. "That's adrenaline, buddy. Humans get a rush from this stuff." Curian's data module pinged. He stared at the scan. Caleb's pupils had dilated again sharply. His heart rate was up, blood pressure increased, but there were no signs of panic. Only readiness. "Adrenaline rush," Caleb said again, his grin widening. Curian recorded everything. Back in the lab, Curian replayed the footage. He slowed down the moment Caleb had heard the simulated howl. The dilation was unmistakable. Not fear-induced paralysis, but anticipation. He presented the findings at the next xenopsychology seminar. "Human pupils dilate in response to fear stimuli," Curian said. "However, the subject appears to derive motivation and exhilaration from the same. This complicates our predictive models." Several tentacled heads turned toward him. "Are you suggesting," one of the professors asked, "that humans weaponize fear responses internally?" "That is the current hypothesis." The room fell into a murmur. Later that week, during a joint survival exercise, the hypothesis was tested again violently. The team was assigned to the Outlands Region 2, a wilderness reserve where predators were semi-contained and monitored. The exercise was to simulate a breakdown of equipment, forcing the team to navigate unaided for 20 kilometers. 2 hours in, the storm hit. Not a simulation. Real. The wind tore through the trees like a blade. The temperature dropped by 15 degrees in minutes. Visibility under 3 meters. One of the Threxian students slipped and broke a lower limb. Curian tried to signal for emergency extraction. "Static." "We're blind," he said. Caleb was already kneeling beside the injured student, cutting away the fabric around the limb with his multi-tool. "We need a splint." "He can't walk like this." "You are not a medic." "I was a lifeguard." "Close enough." Curian blinked. "That is unrelated." Caleb snapped a branch in two and secured it with bandage tape from his pack. "We wait, and he goes into shock. Or we move. The terrain is impassable. Not if we go north by the ridge. That is unverified." Caleb stood, gripping the injured student's arm. "Help me lift." Curian hesitated, then obeyed. They hiked for 4 hours with the storm howling around them. At one point, a falling branch opened a gash across Caleb's shoulder. He hissed, but didn't stop. Only when they reached the emergency shelter beacon did he sit down, pale and shaking. Curian scanned him. "You are injured." Caleb nodded once. "Feels like a deep one. You require stitching. Can you do it?" Curian hesitated. Caleb peeled off the outer layer of his jacket, exposing the wound. "I'll talk you through it." The blood loss was significant. Curian worked fast while Caleb gritted his teeth and gripped the edge of the bench. "Why did you not wait for rescue?" Curian asked. "Because that kid would have died. Your own life was at risk." That's usually how it works, Caleb said. Fear's not a stop sign. It's a flare. Curian recorded that phrase. Over the following weeks, Caleb's recovery was slow but steady. The cut required 14 stitches and daily redressing. He couldn't use his arm properly for over a month. He didn't complain once. Curian observed him constantly, often without asking. One afternoon, during a biomechanics class, the instructor asked for volunteers to test a new exosuit design. Caleb raised his good hand. I'm game. You are still recovering, Curian said. That's why I want to try it. See if it helps. The suit magnified motion, adjusting for limb compensation. Caleb moved awkwardly at first, then more fluidly. Pain? The instructor asked. Yeah, Caleb said. But it's manageable. Curian watched his pupils. Dilated again. Still adrenaline? Caleb looked at him sideways. Yeah, but not the fun kind. Curian logged it. The Academy began circulating Curian's reports. Human autonomic responses were now a study focus, particularly their unique ability to reframe panic as purpose. The Threxian Council deemed it an illogical but operationally effective trait. 3 weeks later, on a field trip to the volcanic caverns of Jalaris 3, the team encountered a seismic tremor. The ground split. Caleb and Curian were on separate sides. Jump, Caleb shouted. It is unstable. You've got one chance. Curian calculated the risk. The data said no. He jumped. Caleb caught him with his recovering arm and nearly collapsed, but held. You are irrational, Curian said, breathless. Caleb grinned. Welcome to the club. That night, Curian entered his final report for the quarter. Observation: human pupils dilate with fear. Secondary observation: they embrace it. Tertiary observation: they become more dangerous when afraid. Conclusion: adrenaline is not merely a chemical. It is a philosophy. The next day, he asked Caleb a question. Would you consider returning to the Outlands? Caleb narrowed his eyes. Why? For further observation. You sure you're not just hoping I do something stupid again? Statistically, it is likely. Caleb laughed. All right. But next time, you carry the splints. Curian didn't understand why that was funny, but he wrote it down anyway. 3 days after the volcanic tremor incident, Curian was summoned to the Office of Interdisciplinary Affairs without explanation. The invitation was delivered via a sealed data scroll instead of the standard pulse notice, which immediately suggested either a commendation or a disciplinary review. He brought both a backup drive and a written testimony, unsure which would be needed. The office was located beneath the main atrium, where the architecture shifted from transparent sky glass to denser, older stone. Curian had never been below level 12 before. The air was warmer and carried a faint metallic tang. Inside, he found Director Isilto seated on a low platform surrounded by panels of bioluminescent script. Her skin flickered between hues of orange and slate, a sign of neutral anticipation among her species. You filed the adrenaline report, she said without preamble. Yes. 5 internal departments have requested access. 1 external agency has requested a physical interview with the subject. Curian paused. Caleb. The human, yes. For what purpose? Unknown. Request was redacted. Curian's lower digits flexed involuntarily. He's a student. He is also an anomaly. Your report indicated sustained performance under stress conditions beyond normal sapien thresholds. That has implications. Implications for what? Containment protocols. Or recruitment. Possibly both. Curian's chest stiffened. Has the subject been informed? Not yet. We are giving you the opportunity to do so first. Why? You have proximity, Director To said. And he listens to you. Curian returned to the upper levels without speaking to anyone. He found Caleb in the maintenance bay, elbow deep in an open drone casing with a grease mark across his cheek and a soldering tool in his teeth. You're early, Caleb said. Curian stepped closer. You are being watched. Caleb didn't look up. Aren't we all? This is different. There has been an external inquiry. They want to speak with you. About what? Your behavior during the last 2 field events. Caleb set the tool down. You mean surviving? They believe it may indicate traits of strategic significance. He wiped his hands on a towel. Is this about the adrenaline thing again? No. It's about what you do with it. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He examined the exposed circuit, then closed the drone casing with a firm click. When did they want to talk? Within the next 10 cycles. Fine, he said. Let's give them something to think about before then. 12 hours later, Curian found himself strapped into a thin plastic harness aboard a three-person glider headed toward the Kelthane Ridges, a jagged cluster of rock formations known for rapid wind shifts and unstable magnetic fields. Caleb was piloting. "This is unsafe," Curian said as the glider tilted slightly left without warning. "That's the point." The third seat was occupied by a quiet aviary student named Lo, who had joined them apparently on a dare and hadn't spoken since departure. "Explain your objective," Curian said loudly over the wind. "You said they're watching, right? Let him watch." The glider dipped as they caught a thermal pocket. Curian's stomach compressed. Lo made a strangled noise. "We're going to test the new NAV system," Caleb said. "It compensates for magnetic drift using tandem gyros. If it works, we can land on the central ridge. If not..." Curian's harness groaned as they took a sharp bank. "We get a great story," Caleb finished. The NAV system failed 30 seconds before they reached the ridge. Caleb's hands moved fast, toggling the manual stabilizers and rerouting power through the auxiliary control strips. The glider shuddered but didn't tumble. They clipped the edge of a rock spire and skidded into a landing that broke one of the undercarriage struts but left them upright. Lo vomited and passed out. Curian unclipped and stared at Caleb. "That was unacceptable. Still alive, aren't we? You have a warped understanding of acceptable risk." Caleb climbed out and grabbed his field pack. "You coming? If this ridge has the mineral pockets they say it does, we can tag 3 unique samples before sunset." Curian followed. They hiked for 4 hours. The terrain was brutal loose shale and jagged outcrops, the kind that shredded boots and scraped exposed limbs. Caleb moved like he'd done it 100 times, crouching low to scan rock faces, occasionally marking a surface with a chalk tag. At one point, Curian slipped on a patch of black moss and opened a gash along his lower limb. Caleb knelt beside him instantly. "Let me see. It is superficial. Doesn't mean it can't get infected." "Hold still." He poured antiseptic from his pack. "It foamed on contact." Curian hissed. "Stings? Yeah. Better than losing a leg." "You have medical training?" "Worked in an ER for 6 months. Mostly brought people coffee. But I watched." Caleb wrapped the wound with practiced fingers, then stood and offered a hand. Curian took it. By dusk, they had collected 7 samples, including one with active crystallization, something not recorded in that region previously. Caleb logged it with a grin. "Let's see them ignore that." They camped in a wind-shadowed depression using emergency thermal sheets and a low-signal beacon for location tracking. Lo woke briefly, muttered something about his ancestors, and went back to sleep. Curian stared at the stars. "Why do you provoke danger deliberately?" Caleb chewed on a ration bar. "Because that's when people show who they are." "You believe stress reveals truth?" "Pressure doesn't create cracks. It shows where they already were." Curian considered that. The next morning, they were retrieved by a scout vessel. Caleb handed over the samples before even getting his pack off. 2 days later, the external agency arrived. They weren't military. They weren't scientists either. 3 delegates, all wearing sterile gray uniforms with no insignia. Their translator used a neutral accent, but their questions weren't neutral. "What's the longest you've gone without sleep?" 72 hours, Caleb said. "Why?" "Forest fire. I was on a volunteer team. Couldn't stop." "Have you ever experienced oxygen deprivation?" "Yeah. Ice diving. Missed the exit hole once." "What did you do?" "Made a new one." They asked about pain thresholds, decision-making under resource scarcity, and whether he'd ever turned on his own group under pressure. "No," Caleb said. "I don't need to win that badly." After they left, Curian approached him outside the south observation deck. "They were measuring volatility." "Yeah," Caleb said. "And I didn't give it to them. They think you were dangerous." "I probably am." Curian tilted his head. "And you are not concerned?" "I'm human," Caleb said. "We're always somebody's threat." 3 days passed. The Academy didn't say what decision had been made. Caleb resumed classes, joined a polar survey team, and submitted a paper on geochemical resonance that got flagged for cross-disciplinary merit. Curian noticed that the other students gave him more space now. Not from fear. From uncertainty. Late one evening, Curian found him alone in the arboretum, half asleep on a bench with a data pad resting on his stomach. "You are not what they expected," Curian said. Caleb opened one eye. "You mean them, or you?" "Both." Caleb sat up. "You ever wonder if that's why they let us in? Not to learn from us. but to see what might happen when we don't follow the script. I think, Curian said slowly, they're beginning to realize that humans don't have a script. Caleb stood. Good. Let's keep it that way. It was 2 weeks after the external agency's visit when Curian received the invitation to accompany Caleb to the Ascension trial on Arid Station. Technically, it wasn't a trial. It was a final practicum for students seeking cross-species field certification. But everyone called it a trial because the success rate hovered around 30%, and failure usually involved either injury or disqualification. Curian had not intended to attempt it until next cycle. Caleb, naturally, had signed up the moment registration opened. You are not qualified, Curian said, staring at the confirmation. Caleb tossed a pair of insulated boots into his pack. That's why I'm doing it. You are still recovering from the glider incident. Recovery's boring. Besides, Arid has full med stations. If I break something again, they can slap a patch on it before the swelling peaks. That is not reassuring. I didn't say it was. They arrived at Arid Station during mid-cycle rest, when most of the station's personnel were asleep and the docking bays echoed with the distant hum of filtration systems. The station wasn't built for comfort. It was a retrofitted mining platform riddled with narrow corridors, low ceilings, and recycled air that always smelled faintly of ozone and citrus peel. The trial briefing took place in a chamber so cold that even the heat-adapted Zarnathi students wore thermal sleeves. Caleb rubbed his hands together and leaned toward Curian. If my fingers fall off, pretend I meant to do it. Curian ignored him. The facilitator, a broad-shouldered Zalari with a voice like ground stone, explained the parameters. Each pair would be dropped into Sector 5, a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels once used for transport. The objective was to reach the surface beacon within 6 hours. Navigation systems, mapping modules, and external comms were disabled. Injuries were to be self-managed. If one member of the pair failed to reach the beacon, both would be disqualified. Why is this always designed like a horror film? Caleb muttered as they were led to the drop chamber. Because stress reveals structural integrity, Curian replied. They descended by lift, then by ladder, then finally through a narrow shaft that spat them into a tunnel so dark it seemed to absorb light. Caleb flicked on his headlamp. Curian activated his low ambient visual adjustment. Which direction? Caleb asked. Curian pulled a dry compass from his pack. West. There is supposed to be a service conduit that leads upward. They moved in silence for over an hour, broken only by the occasional sound of Caleb's boots scraping against debris. The tunnel's curvature made orientation difficult, and twice they had to double back from collapsed segments. At one junction, Caleb crouched suddenly and held out an arm. Gas pocket, he said. Smell that? Curian sniffed. I detect methane. Possibly sulfur. Caleb pulled a mask from his pack and passed a second one to Curian. Put it on. Stay low. They crawled through the next 300 meters. The gas burned Curian's eyes even with the mask, and Caleb's movement slowed until he finally sat down and adjusted the regulator. You are affected, Curian said. Just lightheaded. We need to find clean air soon. A few meters ahead, the tunnel narrowed into a side shaft barely large enough to crawl through. Curian scanned the opening. It leads upward. Then that's our exit. They crawled single file for nearly 20 minutes. The shaft turned 3 times, and twice Caleb had to stop to rest. His breathing was shallow, and Curian noticed his hands shaking. You are experiencing hypoxia. I'm fine. You are not. Caleb grunted and pushed forward. The shaft opened into a chamber lit faintly from above by a cracked ceiling panel. A metal ladder bolted to the far wall led upward toward the beacon. Caleb reached the bottom of the ladder and stopped. Legs cramping, he muttered. Give me a sec. Curian approached and scanned him with a portable vitals reader. Oxygen saturation is below acceptable levels. You must rest. I know my limits. No, Curian said. I do. Caleb exhaled slowly. Okay. 10 minutes later, he stood and gripped the ladder. Ready? Yes. They climbed in silence, each rung creaking under their weight. Halfway up, Caleb paused and looked down. Don't tell anyone I almost passed out, all right? I will not. Thanks. They reached the top with 23 minutes to spare. The beacon activated with a soft tone and a flicker of green light. A retrieval crew arrived moments later, lifting them back to the station's upper decks. Back in the debrief chamber, the facilitator reviewed their telemetry logs. You descended faster than any other team. But you paused 3 times longer than average. Might have breathed a little too deep, Caleb said. You also administered aid to your partner during a flagged hazard. Seemed like the right call. It was. You passed. Caleb nodded once. Curian said nothing. Later, in the infirmary, a medic wrapped a pressure band around Caleb's arm and tapped a readout. You're dehydrated, mildly hypoxic, and borderline febrile. You shouldn't have done this trial. Caleb winced as the band inflated. I know. Curian stood beside the bed, holding a hydration packet. You could have asked for a delay. I didn't want a delay. I wanted to know what I could handle. The medic adjusted the monitor and left them alone. Curian handed him the packet. You handled it poorly. I handled it. That is not the same. I'm aware. Curian sat. You humans prioritize experience over preparation. Caleb opened the packet and drank. Sometimes you don't know what you're preparing for until you've already survived it. That is inefficient. It's how we learn. 2 days later, they boarded the shuttle back to the academy. Caleb's fever had broken, but he moved slower, a residual stiffness in his left leg. During transit, Curian reviewed the footage from the trial. He paused on the moment Caleb had stopped at the gas pocket, rewound, watched again. You smelled it before your sensors registered. Yeah. How? I know what rot smells like. That is not a quantitative assessment. Nope. Curian studied him. You should not be functional. Caleb leaned back in the seat. That's the trick, isn't it? We keep going until we are. You made several suboptimal choices, and still passed. That is irrelevant. To you. They arrived back at the academy just before evening cycle. The main platform was quiet, most students still off station. Caleb limped slightly as they walked toward the dormitory wing. You're going to file another report, aren't you? Yes. What are you going to call this one? Curian thought for a moment. Instinct over protocol, a case study in human risk calibration. Caleb laughed. Catchy. It will not be flattering. I'd be disappointed if it was. They stopped at the intersection where their paths diverged. Curian spoke first. You will not be approached again. Why not? Your data was too inconsistent. They fear unpredictability. Caleb nodded. Good. Curian extended a hand. Until next cycle. Caleb shook it. Try not to get killed without me. Curian watched him walk away. He returned to his quarters and opened a new file. He did not include graphs, charts, or comparative tables. Just one sentence. Humans do not adapt by avoiding risk. They adapt by walking through it, bleeding, and walking anyway.